to our webinar this morning on surviving and responding to grant reviews. This webinar is being hosted by the National Coordinating Center of the RCMARs at UCLA. With funding from the NIA, the Coordinating Center at UCLA works to disseminate RCMAR processes, tools, and results to actively demonstrate the RCMAR's impact upon the health of minority older adults in the U.S. As a land-grant institution, UCLA and the RCMAR Coordinating Center acknowledges our presence on the traditional ancestral territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We hope you can take a minute to acknowledge the ancestral lands you are currently on. The staff at the Coordinating Center work really hard to provide you with updated information about opportunities and resources related to aging in diverse communities. So we really invite you to visit our website regularly for updates and for announcements, and to follow us on social media. Next slide. Reminder, before we begin, please note that we are using Zoom webinar for today's meeting, and participants will be muted throughout the presentation to facilitate recording. We will be distributing today's slides to registered participants and posting this session on our website. Since you're all muted, please take a minute to introduce yourself using the chat function. Let us know who's here by entering your name and institutional affiliation in the chat. Lastly, we have a great presentation in store for you today, and I'm sure some of you already have some burning questions that you'd like to ask our speaker. So please take advantage of the Q&A function to submit your questions. We'll make sure to respond to them at the end. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Gallo from Johns Hopkins, who is our speaker today. Dr. Gallo has been a great supporter of our RCMAR program and leads the Mixed Methods Research Training Program for Health Sciences at Hopkins. A major focus of Dr. Gallo's research concerns the form and cause of depression among older adults. He is the PI for a long-term follow-up of prospects, prevention of suicide in primary care elderly, a collaborative trial, a randomized trial of depression management in primary care practices. Given his expertise in mixed methods research, Dr. Gallo will be speaking to us today on surviving and responding to the NIH grant review. Thank you, Dr. Gallo, for being with us today.
Great, great to be here. So I'll put my slides up. How's that? Okay, good. Yeah, it's really an honor to be asked, and it's an honor to be involved with the RCMAR group as well, and I'm really glad to be able to participate today by providing this sort of my take on surviving and responding to NIH grant review. And we're all sort of in Zoom hell, I guess you'd say, and we're all tired of Zoom. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time to participate in this webinar. So what we're going to be talking about today is responding to the pink sheets. Now, there actually was a time before the NIH Commons, believe it or not, when you got your critique in the mail on pink sheets because they were carbon copies that were typed, and the part that the investigator got were pink. So sometimes people refer to them as pink sheets. And the idea is you may have gotten a close but no cigar review, or for whatever reason, you're going to submit a revised application of a first application. And we're going to talk about situations where your application may or may not have been discussed. And before really getting into the idea of how to think about the response, I wanted to remind everybody of the scoring system that NIH uses to think about interpretation of the score. And remember that the score that you get on the summary statement is really an average of all the scores that are provided by everybody on the committee. So if you get a score of 40 or 30, it's the equivalent of a 3 or a 4. And what I wanted to point out here is that a lot of times people will talk to me and they say, oh, you know, I got a 38, and they're kind of bummed out. And I want to emphasize that those are not bad scores, right? I mean, if you look at the scoring here, a 4, even a 5, has a lot of strong points to it. And you have to remember that sometimes when grants are not discussed, it's not because it wasn't a good grant. It may have been on the threshold for the grants that are not going to be discussed in that study section. So the first point I want to make is you can't interpret the score until you see the summary statement, until you see the reviewer's comments. Now, the second of the first points I want to make is that there's evidence that minority applicants often don't resubmit grants that are not funded the first time. And while there are a lot of reasons for this, we're not going to, can't go into the details here. It does emphasize the importance of mentoring and the function that the RICMAR has. And, you know, my point of view as a mentor has been that minority applicants, your point of view and the way you, the perspectives you bring on something is like gold. It's like a national treasure or a national resource. And it's very important to be persistent as you can and draw on the strengths in your environment to be persistent. In fact, if you look at the data, these are applications that were not discussed the first time around. And you can see even applications in the 50 to 90 or not discussed range, substantial numbers of them are funded the next time that they go in. The blue and the green here is type 1 versus type 2. It's sort of a regular application or renewal of a project that's ongoing. So you can see there's substantial numbers that get funded even when it's not discussed. So the second early point I want to make is you got to be in it to win it. And resubmitting is just part of the game. Now, to think about NIH, or just to give you a short review, NIH policy on resubmissions, and we'll have the slides available and you can check out this website. But basically, when you're resubmitting a grant that's already been reviewed and has comments, you're going to be including an introduction that summarizes the changes that you've done in the grant, generally in one page. Now, only a single resubmission of a new grant is accepted, but it doesn't mean that you can't submit the grant a third time. It's just that when you submit it the third time, it has to go in as if it's a brand new grant. That means that there can't be anything in the application or even the letters that say, oh, you responded to such and such a comment, or that you know what the score was before, or something like that. It should be free of all of that. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider modifications based on a previous review. It's just that when it goes in for the sort of third time, it has to be like a new application. So I just wanted to point that out. If the application does have things that refer to a previous submission, it may not be reviewed actually in that study section. So you got the score and the summary statement. Now what do you do? So the first thing you usually do is deal with the initial shock. So as this cartoon says here, you tested positive for being negative. In other words, if you're like me, you're looking at the thing and your eye goes immediately to the weaknesses and the problems. And so it's best maybe to just do an initial look over of the pink sheets and then leave them alone for a while, have your emotional reaction. After all, these strangers that you don't know said, your baby is ugly. And you can think of the stages of grief, right? You know, there was nothing wrong with this, or the reviewers don't know what they're talking about, and then maybe if I just tweak it a little bit, it'll be fine. And then, you know, coming to the realization that, oh my God, I actually have to go through this again and I just have to deal with it, you know, sort of resignation. So just be aware of the emotional response. But then there's the second look where you're looking at the pink sheets again, you know, and then the idea is not to take the criticism personally. It's supposed to be about the best science from the perspective of the committee that, you know, may or may not know your specific content area well, which is fodder for another discussion about how to prepare the grant in a way that sort of takes into account that not everybody might be as enthusiastic about the topic as you. And when you're looking at the pink sheets a second time around, take note of the strengths that were mentioned as well. So the next thing is gathering information. Now, after investigators get the score, which will appear on NIH Commons, you know, weeks before the summary statement often, the tendency is to say, oh, I should call the program officer now and talk about it. But I don't think that's a good idea. What I think you should do is talk to the program officer after you understand the review, and maybe even after you've considered your response and gone through the steps that I'm going to outline shortly. And of course, you'd want to touch base with mentors, people with more experience. But it is important to talk with the program officer because they can help you interpret the meaning of the score. So was there enthusiasm for revising and resubmitting? Are you close, or is a major overhaul needed? What things in the revision are needed to be emphasized? And I would point out, when you get the summary statement, there's a resume. And if your grant was discussed, the end of that resume talks about strengths and weaknesses. That discussion is created by the people who were at the review, the scientific review administrator. So typically they are telling you these are the 3 or 4 things that came up in the discussion. So you'd want to pay particular attention to those. So the next is to make a list. An itemized and uncensored list, not like the guy in the cartoon who's saying, here it is, my novel. I'll be interested to hear your compliments. You want to create a comprehensive list. And again, another temptation is to simply respond bullet by bullet, point by point down the summary statement, like this cartoon where she's saying stimulus response. Don't you ever think? The problem with doing, you know, point by point, there's situations where that's just fine, but for one practical thing is you may not be able to fit that all into the one page that's required for the resubmission where you're summarizing. So what I like to do is think about what I call cooking the comments. That is, grouping the comments into themes or themes or similar concerns that might be voiced by different reviewers or concerns that are overlapping and so on. And part of what that does when you do it this way, it shows how thoughtful you are, how carefully you considered the comments, even if you didn't that much, really. When you get the summary statement, it's in the form that's on the left here, the left side, where each reviewer is giving the strengths and weaknesses for each criteria that they're asked to review the grant on. But what I'm asking you to do is convert it to what's on the right side of the screen. So you can see all of the strengths of all the reviewers related to significance, approach, etc. And similarly for the weaknesses. Don't forget to do it for the strengths also. And once you do that, you come up with a document that might look something like this. And what I do is, because I'm not that sophisticated, I guess, the summary statement's a PDF. So I do Control A, get the whole thing, and then I paste it into a Word document and then fix it up and move the comments around. Once I have it like that, what I do is I like to physically cut the review, physically cut the paper into the comments. Now, perhaps that's a way of getting back at the review committee. I don't know. But what I find that lets you do is you can arrange the comments on a table, and then like in the lower left here, they're looking at a sign, it says stop and think, and it says, it sort of makes you stop and think, doesn't it? By freeing up the comments to be able to move them around, then you can see, are there sort of thematic areas that need to be addressed. So for example, in the example here, like maybe there's some comments around sampling or around measurement or something like that you can group them. And then I might create a draft like this, where I have said, this is a draft of the introduction that will go with the response to the grant, where if at the top, I'm giving them some strengths, and then I'm saying, nevertheless, weaknesses were identified, which we address below under 5 rubrics. Now, you may not be able to see it very well. I purposely wanted to show you the whole page, though, because these, with the shading, those are the rubrics. Now, you only count 4 rubrics because I'm not showing you the second page, because when I'm drafting it, I'm not worried about whether it's one page or not. And you see, I'm starting to identify placeholders for sections or the reviewers that gave those comments. So the other thing I do as part of this process is, once I sort of have this list of concerns in hand, I reread the grant. But what I like to do is, because I'm trying to get total picture, more like Forrest, not so much in the details yet, is I print the grant and then go through the grant with those comments in hand and marking the areas in the hard copy that I know are going to have to be modified, changed. There might be things that are low effort, right? Revising a list of measures, or, knowing something you have to do with the power analysis, or there might be major areas. So I'm marking the grant. These are going to be major areas that I'll have to work on. I like to do it that way because it helps sort of prioritize what you do when you do go in the grant. But even before touching the grant, having made that list and cooked the comments, then I think you're at a point where you can talk to mentors, colleagues, and you can share that list of organized weaknesses and strengths with other people and get their take on it. I mean, you may even in that document you've created have sort of a indented shorthand place of what you're thinking of in terms of your response. So that way people can give you feedback and help you consider the critiques and, if there are messages in between the lines of things that are more or less important. And you're going to have to make decisions about whether you alter aspects of the design. Is it feasible to make design changes you're being asked? And also the concept of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, changing something that was not identified as a problem can be a mistake unless it's really something that you missed the first time. But otherwise, making changes risks opening up new opportunities for the reviewer. Because frankly, if you create something that's as perfect as you can get, there's some reviewer who didn't see it before that will wind up bringing something else up anyway. It's always good when you're going back in, if you can, to keep gathering pilot data and to have that as part of the renewal, that really gets brownie points with the reviewers. And that's always very, very helpful if you can do that. And then starting to write your reply and starting to work on the grant and the response early does help you force to see the work that you'll need to do. So as I said, it's only one page you get, but I wouldn't worry about that when I'm trying to be complete about responding to the reviewers. The other thing is that you'll have the roster at the end of the summary statement, and there could be some changes in that, but very likely, and of course you don't know who specifically reviewed your grant in terms of first, second, third reviewer, but keep in mind that it's very likely that some of the reviewers will be the same. And I think it's a good idea is to take that roster and do a literature search on everybody. Because what can happen is you're saying, I'm doing a project on X, and on the committee is either somebody who's an expert on X, or they think they're an expert on X, and you didn't cite them at all. So, I mean, you don't want to be obvious or facetious about it, but I think that's a good thing to do. And then, as you're creating the response in that one pager, it's good to thank the reviewers. Keep in mind, the reviewers spent a lot of time looking at your application and really donate the time to advance the quality of science in the field. So I always begin by thanking them. I do like to say that the critique, the changes made in response to the critique result in a stronger application, and provide them with some positive comment at the beginning, and then say, nevertheless, here are the ways that we're going to respond. If they make comments that you think show they didn't understand what you were trying to say, then you really have to think of it as your problem and try to make it clearer how you've explained it. The other thing, sometimes, honestly, what I've done is sometimes in that kind of a situation, it's common to you think, well, that's in there. Like, why didn't they see I said such and such? Well, honestly, what I've done sometimes is make a change in that paragraph, highlight the paragraph, make them read it again, with your change that hopefully made, that made it clearer. What about taking issue with a review? I think you really have to get a lot of advice, if you're going to go against what a reviewer is saying and not do what they're asking you to do. In general, I think it's a good idea to just use the review as a blueprint for the revision. But if you do have to do something that seemingly is not agreeing with the critique, you really want to make sure you're justifying it very, very well and talk with colleagues about it. If reviewers disagree, what I think, obviously, is there some middle way to get at it? Whatever you pick, whatever side you come down on, to really make sure you justify the response. But what I tend to do is juxtapose their critiques. That way you make it clear to the next round that there may be different ways to approach this, and here's why you are going down one path or another. And again, as I keep saying through this, is talk to other people about it to help you think, whatever the issue is through. So the format of the response, we've said it, you do want it to be in detail. It can be point by point, or organize the response into themes, because you only have one page to respond. And this is your chance to show the reviewers how thoughtful, careful, and responsive you are. So the NIH a number of years ago changed the rules about requiring showing the changes that you've made in the research plan itself. That is no longer necessary. And I just wanted to say this little picture here with the spiral eyes, that's me, having read some grants where somebody marked the changes by these little triangles in the text. And I don't know, it may be some kind of neurological disorder that I have or something, but all I could see looking at the page were those little triangles. It was so distracting. I wouldn't do that. What I would do is use a bar in the left-hand margin. They will continue to accept applications that note where there are changes, but don't change, don't use bold, don't use italics, put a bar in the left-hand margin. And one place where you can find how to do that is this link that I've provided there. And it's not very difficult. So I want to drive the point home again. So the initial introduction identifies as the page or section number, and you may provide the vertical line in the left-hand margin that shows the changes. Don't use bolding, don't use italic, don't use symbols or brackets because it's very distracting. I've never heard a reviewer complain that they couldn't find where the changes were. You do hear reviewers say, gee, I wish I could figure out where they made the change in the grant. So I would really keep that in mind. So examples. We want to thank the reviewers for their helpful comments. The application is stronger as a result. Changes in the text have been indicated with a bar in the left-hand margin. We agree the second line, summers are so rotten in Avon, may have been too harsh. We have replaced this line on page 2. Or the reviewer is correct that the original design was much ado about nothing. The last 6 stanzas have been rewritten. So I like to use this little symbol for a section that, I don't know, I just think it's cool looking. It saves you space in the introduction page and helps the reviewer identify where the change was made. And then mark the change with a bar in the left-hand side of the grant. Let me show you a real example. Now, this example of an introduction got kind of, this was a case where it is not themes, but they are it's responding point by point, but it kind of got crowded on the page. And so I didn't want to present the reviewer with a whole block of text on the page. By the way, as an aside, when I see that in a grant with very few headings or signposts, figures, or tables, just page after page of text, it's really nauseating to see that. It's very, I mean, personally, it's very difficult. If I were a computer, would have no trouble parsing it. But being a human being, trying to read it, very difficult. So what I did here was we did highlighting every other point to draw the eye to what was one point after another. But if you look up at the top, there are comments from the reviewers that are positive. I've told them how the changes were identified. And throughout, I'm telling them what sections are involved, where the changes are that are relevant. And then in the grant, here's a change marked on the side. Now, I'll tell you quickly how you do this. If you were to take this kind of as a big paragraph here, if I were to double click on that in Word, it highlights the whole thing. And so when I go to Format, Borders, left side, it would put a line for that whole section, E2. But I only want to do part of it. So what I have to do is I have to go here where for this other line, the line right above it, where it says 3 and put a return, hit the return character there. It doesn't change how it looks. It just puts a return character there. And then I go to this line where it says data show, put a return character there. So there's a return character there. So when I double click in the middle of this, it only highlights those lines. So when I go to Format, Borders, and add the line to the left-hand side, it will put a line there. So I can modify the thickness if I want to. But by doing it that way, it's very unobtrusive in terms of reading the grant. And by the way, don't forget about other components of the grant that sort of can respond to reviewers too. Like letters. Even if you think about like resubmitting a K, sometimes what comes up is there may be things about, feasibility or, or ambitiousness. Although the reviewer said it was too ambitious. That's where maybe, when it goes in again, a letter of support, even better than coming from you saying, yeah, I can do it. Yeah, it's feasible. But from mentors, the letters of support, right, might be better places. I used to think that reviewers let's say in a K, looked at letters of support and said, okay, Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, yep, there's the letter. No, they actually read the letters, right? I mean, not that you're just going to meet with somebody every week, but what are you going to talk about? And so they are looking carefully at the letters. You will have to be careful using appendices, but judicious use of appendices when you respond it might be useful to show instruments or something like that. Excuse me, I'm sure it's just a credit card calling. And providing new pilot data, right? We talked about that. So other components of the grant. So you've done all of that, you've revised the grant, you've written and rewritten the response. I think it's good then to go back. We cut the summary statement into ribbons, but now you may want to go back and reread the summary statement. Make sure you've responded to the spirit, the intent, and the specifics of the critiques that are there. And if time allows, send the grant to people who can, take a look at it with maybe fresh eyes who are familiar with it. And which is another reason to really highlight, using the bar, what areas you've changed. It makes it easier to look at the introduction, look at it. They may not need to reread the whole thing again. And once you've done that and you send it in, take a break, have a life. And this is what I'm showing you here. These are my kids and my grandson, my 3 kids there on the left, my grandson in the middle. On the right hand here are our family members, Bingo in the foreground, Buster Brown in the background. And for a long time, I've interacted with people around the country collecting these cast iron toy cabs that were created in the 1920s, often for specific cab companies. And this one says Vernon 1212, which is from Baltimore, and fascinates me. 100 years later, and the cab companies still have the same phone number. Stuff like that fascinates me. So I would acknowledge certainly my colleagues at the Johns Hopkins, Rick Marr, Marilyn Albert, George Reebok, Roland Thorpe, the Advanced Research Institute in Geriatric Mental Health with Marty Bruce and Steve Bartels, and the Mixed Methods Training Program. The website is there, but if you Google Mixed Methods Training, it'll come up. And I shared a paper we did where we asked scholars and consultants in that program to send us summary statements of funded and unfunded mixed methods applications. And then we did an analysis essentially of what reviewers said, what were the pitfalls, et cetera. And I thought maybe that's relevant or useful, if you're in even any kind of grant, but specifically for mixed methods grants. So I think we have about probably 20 minutes or something for questions. And I put my email there too. So if something comes up later, just let me know and we can sort of continue the discussion beyond this 1 hour session, if that's useful. So,
thank you so much, Dr. Gallo. We have a number of different questions queued up for you. So thank you so much again for your presentation. Is it okay if I go ahead and ask the first question?
Yeah, I'll stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't been looking at the chat or the Q&A, so I wouldn't get distracted.
No worries. No worries. I've got you covered.
I'll just listen to you. Go ahead.
Sounds good. Okay, so this is a question from Mark. So the question is, after reviewing one of my summary statements, I received mostly positive comments, some concerns, but not much additional feedback. However, in some cases, the reviewer scores didn't correspond well with the feedback. So if the scores do not coincide well with the feedback, it seems unfair. Am I able to request from the SRO or PO to please ensure that I receive the appropriate feedback?
Yeah, I hate when that happens. In the study section, usually the scientific review officer reminds the reviewers that, if you're to make sure that your score lines up with the comments that you're giving. I don't think it's ever a bad idea to ask questions about it. You might not get much of a response. You may have to just simply respond to the comments that you have and make the best of that. But that's not supposed to happen. In other words, they don't mention very many weaknesses, but it says 4. or something like that. And some of it can be the way that they weighed, you know, that even though it might not look like much, they just were giving that more weight maybe than you would have liked, you know, and so it drove their score, say a 4 or 5. But it doesn't hurt to talk with the mistakes can happen for one thing, and you know, get some comments from them or the program officer to help you think about how you respond.
Excellent.
That, by the way, of course, the program officer, of course, I meant to mention this, that's the person whose name and contact information is up in the upper right-hand corner of the summary statement, by the way, of course.
Excellent. Another question that had come in was, particularly in this time during the pandemic, with increasing NIH applications, what does it mean if your application is not discussed? This person recently had an R01 not discussed, and was told that given the scores, it would typically have been discussed. Do you know how the pandemic is affecting?
I don't. I mean, if I don't have any data, I would only be speculating, really. I don't know. I guess if there are more applications, I guess then there's more. There's going to be a bigger half. You know, if there's 60 applications instead of 40, you know, now 30 of them, or 30 or 40 are not discussed instead of 20. I guess. I mean, you know, well, this is just me thinking, but sometimes I think, well, don't overthink it. I mean, you can't do anything about the pandemic. You can't do anything about the number of applications. Remember my rule number 2, you have to be in it to win it, you know? So, I mean, you just do the best you can and respond. I mean, I still think what I said about not discussed is still true. Doesn't mean it's a bad grant.
Sorry about that. So there's a couple of questions submitted regarding timeline. What is the timeline after submission for when one should expect to get a score and the comments?
Okay, so that depends on your personality structure. If you're very anxious, like me, or you're dying to know, well, first of all, NIH Commons will generate an email to you when there's something happened with your application. Like now the score is available. Maybe not the pink sheets, but the score. So that usually happens a week, seems to me, usually a week or 10 days after it was reviewed, although it can be sooner. But if you're like me, what you might do is, you know, the day after it's reviewed, the subsequent days after it's reviewed, you might check each day or check each hour and see if it's there. It will appear there actually within a couple of days of the review a lot of times. The pink sheets may take longer. You know, they're not as long as it used to be probably, but you know, those usually in a couple of weeks, 2 to 6 weeks, in that ballpark, something like that, I would say. Then they will appear there. So I hope that answers your question. But
Sure.
In other words, you can find out faster by just checking all the time for the score.
There's another question about timing. Can you talk a little bit about the timing of resubmission? Is it generally worthwhile or strategic to resubmit in the next cycle?
I think it depends. It probably depends on a lot of different things. Well, first of all, I think there are rules about you can't resubmit until you've gotten the summary statement. Right. So there may be some limit. So when you say next cycle, it really might not read literally the next cycle. It might be the cycle after that. I mean, you could think of pros and cons. I don't know that there's a particular reason. I mean, if it's timely, something that's timely, it'll still be timely. But there might be other reasons why, like maybe it would be a lot stronger if there was certain pilot data that you had that might necessitate, going in after, the very next cycle when you could possibly put it in. I don't know that there are particular advantages or disadvantages, honestly.
Mhm. Awesome. Another question has come in. Do you have any advice for applicants who receive a pretty good score and the program officer requests a response to reviewers before the IC meets?
Yeah, so, right, that can happen. My understanding of that process is what they may be doing is, if it may be on the cusp, maybe it's going to be, they're preparing for the council when the grants are going to be discussed for funding. And so what they sometimes need is a response from the investigator so that if it's discussed in these meetings they have leading up to council, they can say, oh, Dr. So-and-so's got a, they can fix that easily. That's my whether, to what extent that actually comes up, I don't know. But it is important if you get that kind of request not to dilly-dally too long, because they need that to prepare for the council meeting. I mean, that's often a good sign. It doesn't necessarily mean, oh, you're going to get funded, but it's better than getting a lousy score.
Awesome, thank you. Can you comment on the paper showing that there's no agreement between reviewers on the quality of the grants when given the same grant?
Yeah, I guess it can be a crapshoot. That's what you're saying. You mean like data that's shown when a grant is reviewed, right? Different ways, sort of like different IRBs come up with different. I don't.
Is the process really working? What can we do about that?
I mean, talk to mentors about where, what committees the grant should go to, that kind of thing. I mean, we are talking about resubmission, so a little bit it's the homework at the beginning. I mean, to talk with mentors, but also with program officers, even the SROs of particular committees. And there's a form, it used to be a letter, but I think now, recently in grants, there's been a form that you fill out that where you can sort of direct it to a particular committee and why you think it should go to that committee. And that's a good thing to do. I mean, if you've got a rationale, you should do, you should do that. Otherwise, it gets directed by to particular committees by CSR. But that's something to, to work with mentors, program officer about where to direct the grant. And if you can, the rosters are public. So when your grant's reviewed, yeah, there might be some people that are added for, for whatever reason, but the rosters are public. So if one committee seems reasonable, I always tell people, do a literature review on the roster and make sure that, you're not forgetting somebody. It's a human process. That's what you're saying with some of these.
I have another question. These are a couple of more technical questions. This person said, my proposal did not get discussed at the review panel, but there are two available actions, JIT and human subject. Should I submit these?
Oh, you mean you're being asked to submit them? Well, again, you might want to ask the program officer, but in the old days, it's not so much now. When you got the request for the just-in-time information, it used to mean, oh, that grant was going to get funded, but it doesn't really particularly mean that now. I mean, you're not going to. I mean, I guess you're not going to go wrong by submitting it, but you might want to ask about that. There's some reason why they're asking for that. The just-in-time information is usually the up-to-date information that they need, like people's other support and up-to-date biosketches and things that they need before they would actually give the notice of award, right? That's what that means. So hopefully that's what it means for you.
Excellent. Another question. Team science seems to be the norm now. And so the question is, if you submit as the PI, and it turns out that the reviewer's comments point out that your role may be impacting the score in a negative way, is it possible to resubmit the same grant with a different PI or to reorder the team roles?
Gee, I don't know off the top of my head. There are rules about, like if you are responding to an RFA or a certain type of an announcement, or you're changing, from a R21 to an R01, there are rules that then it has to be like a new application. So in that situation, I guess so you'd have to find out. I don't know offhand what the rules are. Although I guess, off the top of my head, if I were thinking about it, I'd say, what about, would being multiple PI help? Like you borrow strength, so to speak, from some other person and then go in as a multi-PI type application, right? Depending on if you can justify it and what it is.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, another question's come in. I understand that most of the time, a revise and resubmit is the best idea, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more, perhaps with some examples on when you would choose to do a new submission instead of a resubmission, or basically when you wouldn't want to revise resubmit?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you got comments where you realize it's not going to be feasible, or you really have to change the aims and the idea, you may be better off going as a new grant. I mean, I want to say almost always it's a good idea to think of resubmitting it. I mean, doing it as a resubmission, because you're partly, when you're writing the grant, you're and then resubmitting it, it's how can I say this? It's like you're developing a relationship with the committee, and so they're saying, oh, they really tried to respond, and so you may sort of get some credit for that, but you might not, and so that's really a strategic decision, you have to, but I guess from this talk, I didn't make that decision based on solely the idea that, oh shoot, there was a lot of negative stuff or something like that. Because as I showed you, grants that were not discussed, significant numbers of them get funded the second time around. So I think you have to be a little strategic there.
Yeah, and along those lines then, a question has come in about how long you have to resubmit after reviewing the comments. So I guess, along the lines of some of the other questions, you don't have to resubmit immediately, right? It doesn't have to be right at the next cycle. And so what would be your suggestion around timing?
Well, there are rules about that, which in that slide that I showed early on, I think it's like 37 months. In other words, within that window, it can still be a resubmission. Beyond that window, it would have to go in as a new application, meaning you're not creating an introduction and showing changes. And I would reiterate, if you have comments and you're submitting as a new application, like it might be the third time you're submitting it, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to what reviewers said. Just make the changes that are There might be comments that you think you can ignore, and put it in as a new application. But when you do that, if it's going to the same committee, some of the same people may be seeing it. So is there a specific time? I mean, you don't want to wait too long. You probably wouldn't want to wait 3 years unless there are extenuating circumstances. But it's not uncommon, in the 2 cycles later, you're putting it in. That might happen.
Sure. Excellent. And then one last question. What are your thoughts of having 2 stage investigators serving as multiple PIs on a submission?
Wait, I didn't hear the first part of what you said.
So having 2 early stage investigators as multi-PIs.
I don't know. I hadn't thought of it. I mean, if I were reviewing it, I'm not sure it would bother me. They're qualified to be a PI, and you're making an argument about why they should lead it and what their biosketch is. And if you had 2 of them, that's okay too. I mean, if it's an R01, then I wouldn't see. It's not like you need to have a senior person leading the R01. If you're doing the R01, that's you. Right? I mean,
well, thank you so much. We're almost at time. These have been great questions. Thank you to all of our participants. Know that we will be sharing the slides and the materials discussed today with you via email. We will be sending out a short survey to you at the end of this presentation. So please give us your feedback. As the coordinating center, we appreciate getting suggestions on what topics you would like to hear about. And so feel free to give us your comments. And again, thank you, Dr. Gallo. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure.
I hope that our participants will let you know if any other questions come in. Dr. Gallo has made himself available if folks have additional questions that they want to present to him. Thank you, Anna, and the RICMAR Coordinating Center staff for supporting our effort today. It always takes a village to make these run, so thank you so much. And thank you to the NIH for funding our efforts. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great Friday.
Yeah, everybody, thank you so much.